Hi, I'm Debbie Wilson, and I'd like to talk today about Hanukkah. We first began celebrating Hanukkah as an alternative to Christmas. We stopped celebrating all of the secular holidays, and so originally I introduced Hanukkah to my family just kind of to help them get through the holiday season. But later, when I began to research it, I was shocked when I stumbled across all sorts of prophetic connections. So I'd like to try to share some of what I found because I really believe that this event contains keys that will be necessary in understanding some last days events. So first, I need to tell you just in a nutshell about this historical event that was prophesied by Daniel hundreds of events before it actually happened. So it commemorates an event that happened around 168 BC. Alexander the Great had taken over basically all of that Mideastern world and further. All of the known world at that time, pretty much, he had taken over. So we're talking a one world government. And then after he was gone, it was kind of divided up into, I believe, 4 parts. So there was a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes, and he was over the part that had Israel in it. And Epiphanes, it means illustrious or manifestation, because Antiochus, he actually believed that he was the physical manifestation of the god Zeus. And he even had coins minted that said, King Antiochus, God made visible. So he began pressuring the Jewish people to become more Greek. He wanted a united empire. So he went into the temple and he set up an idol in the temple. And he slaughtered a pig on the altar, which is an unclean animal, and the Bible calls the pig an abomination as far as being unclean. And that desecrates the altar. That is actually what an abomination of desolation is or was. And it makes the holy place defiled and desolate, because it can no longer be used as a temple. So he abolished the sacrifices to the God of Israel, and the temple pretty much became a pagan temple. Also, they began to persecute anyone who followed God's laws, anyone who observed the Sabbath or had a scroll, a Bible. Anyone who circumcised their sons was killed. They forced people to sacrifice unclean animals to their gods, and there was great pressure to comply to their ways, to let go of their beliefs, of Israel's beliefs, and their practices and worship. So one day, an old man named Mattathias was at the temple, and there was a priest there who went along with the Greeks, and he was making a pagan sacrifice. So old Mattathias reacted with a righteous zeal, and he struck down that priest. And then he called out in a loud voice, "Let everyone who is zealous for God's laws follow me." So he and a small remnant of people fled, and they fled into the mountains, and they hid out there. They did a lot of fasting and praying. And they led a guerrilla warfare against this great, mighty army that had taken over the entire area of the world. It took them 3.5 years. And I want you to remember that number, 3.5 years. And this little ragtag group of people won against that massive, mighty, well-trained army. They drove them out, and they retook their temple, which was all defiled with idols and unclean sacrifices. So they had to clean it all out and build a new altar. They rededicated the temple, and part of that process is to light a menorah in the temple. Now, although the authenticity is uncertain, it is recorded in historical writings, and it is implied in 2 Maccabees. that they found one vessel of oil that was sealed and undefiled, which was only enough to keep the menorah lit for one day. Now, you're really not supposed to ever allow the light of the menorah to go out once it's been lit, because it represents the Spirit of God. And the olive oil had to be processed in a special way to create a very pure oil for the temple. And it would take 8 days to prepare more oil. So they decided to light the menorah anyway, because they were excited. And according to tradition, they were amazed that it burned for 8 days. So that's where we get the tradition of the special Hanukkah menorah that has 9 candles, one for each of the 8 days, plus a servant candle to light the others. There's also another reason for the 8-day festival. They had not been able to celebrate Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, because they were hidden off out in the mountains. And that's one of the biblical festivals, Sukkot is. And so it was so very important that they decided to do Hanukkah or this 8-day celebration also as kind of a late festival or Feast of Tabernacles, which is also called Sukkot. I know that's confusing to use all these different names. But anyway, that's the basic story that Hanukkah commemorates. Now let me tell you about the prophetic significance. So in Matthew chapter 24, we're told a story about when Messiah was asked about the end of the days. And he spoke about the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. Now, if you go and read that passage by Daniel, and it's in Daniel chapter 7 through 12, where the whole prophecy is, you will see that he is actually prophesying the coming destruction of the temple that Hanukkah commemorates. Of course, when Messiah said this, it had already happened in 168 BC. But he was telling his disciples to watch for this in the future end times, as an end times event. So the events of Hanukkah, which you can read about in the book of Maccabees, are a shadow picture of what is to come. And when you read that prophecy in Daniel, where it's foretelling the event, the prophecy continues on as though it were an end times prophecy. It's very easy to miss, and it's hard to catch. And remember that the books of Maccabees used to be part of our canon of biblical books. It was Martin Luther who separated them out and labeled them as Apocrypha. And I should mention that he also separated out the books of Hebrews, James, the letters of John, and the book of Revelation into a separate appendix as well. They were restored after his death. But that's for another video. Let's get back to the prophetic significance of Hanukkah. So it's also worth noting that in Daniel chapter 7, he describes first a dream which included a lion, a bear, and a leopard. These same symbolic animals are echoed in Revelation chapter 13 when speaking of the beast. So just as each beast in Daniel chapter 7 represents a kingdom led by a man, this final beast in Revelation chapter 13 will be composed of those same kingdoms and led by a man. So remember that it took Israel, that little group of Israelites, 3.5 years to retake their temple. Notice that Daniel goes on to talk about the prince who will come in the end times, and he will make a covenant for a week. Well, that word in Hebrew is Shavua, and it actually means 7 years. In the middle of the week, the 7 years, he will break that covenant, which is 3.5 years. So then let's go to Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, where it says, Go to measure the temple of God and the altar with its worshippers, but exclude the outer court. Do not measure it, because it has been given to the Gentiles. They will trample on the holy city for 42 months. 42 months is 3.5 years. Then in Revelation chapter 12, verse 6, it says, "The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days, which is 3.5 years, that same Hanukkah amount of time." Now it's recorded in John chapter 10, verses 22 and 23, that Yeshua, Jesus, went to the porch of Solomon on the Feast of Dedication. Dedication in Hebrew is called Hanukkah, so it was at Hanukkah. The porch of Solomon is right by the Temple Mount, where the historic Hanukkah event had taken place. I believe it's significant that Yeshua made it a point to be in Jerusalem on that date because he had previously avoided going to Jerusalem because he knew that the Pharisees were going to try to kill him. But anyway, while he was there, it was at that time that he proclaimed, "I am the light of the world." And you have to understand that Hanukkah is also known as the Festival of Light. Hanukkah is not one of the 7 biblical festivals, but it's still important. First let me say that in Maccabees, at the end of First Maccabees, I believe, it was stated and proclaimed, they made a proclamation that it should be celebrated every year. So since it used to be as a part of our canon, I think we should pay attention to that. And also because Yeshua, I believe that he celebrated it there because he did show up. Gee, I'm stumbling over my words. But he showed up there in Jerusalem at the Temple Mount during the time that Hanukkah was being celebrated. And it is an important shadow picture of what is to come because he referred to it as an end of days sign of that event. So it's complete with an antichrist, a man of lawlessness, persecution of believers, an oppressive, godless, one-world government that tries to force the people to not worship God. It demonstrates for us exactly what is meant by an abomination of desolation. And most importantly, it instructs us what to do. It shows us that when that day comes, that we have to choose between obeying our God and obeying an oppressive government, that we have to choose our God. We are not to compromise our beliefs and conform to this world. It shows us that there is a time to stand up for righteousness. And I think it's very applicable for a time such as today. Hanukkah commemorates the cleansing and rededication of the temple, which should bring to mind the cleansing and rededication of our lives as walking, living temples. Yeshua referred to the symbolism of his body as a temple in John chapter 2, verses 19 through 21. And our bodies are referred to as a temple in Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians chapter 6. So this season is a reminder that we are to be a light to the world. And we do not put our light under a basket, but we need to shine that light into the darkness. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. I encourage you to research it for yourself, and I also encourage you to get the book of Maccabees. You can find it online, just free, I believe, as a PDF format, and just read it. Or you can just buy the books themselves. I have something called a Sefer, Cepher, and it's a translation of the Bible that has all of the books restored that used to be in our canon. So I kind of enjoy having the convenience of having them all together there. And I have learned a lot from reading those extra books. You can think of them as historical documents that help in understanding the other books of the canon that we have now. So, okay, that's it in a nutshell, and I hope that this has inspired you to think about bringing the celebration of Hanukkah into your home. Thank you.